So I was asked this question by one of my followers: what do you mean the left is controlled opposition? I thought they were in power. How can they be controlled opposition if they're the dominant force in society? This is a good question because I've used the terms controlled opposition and left in inconsistent ways throughout my videos, so I'm going to give you a little rundown on theory. My view isn't necessarily novel, but I can explain things in a way that is hopefully a little bit more digestible than some other places on YouTube, and provide some current and relevant examples of the theory in action to give you a better picture of what is going on with politics in the world. So a couple of weeks ago, I was on this Twitter live, and this woman was going on about Republicans are for the rich, Democrats are for everyone else, or something to that effect. And for anyone who's actually paying attention, the second part of that statement is obviously false. The Democrats are better organized, better funded, really significantly better funded, and enjoy the support of mainstream media and academia. If you want to define that as the left, then the left is very much in charge. Massive corporations are now on board with radical left-wing politics. This is the woke capital your hip intellectual dark web thought leader has been talking about. So why is this exactly? Have billionaires decided they actually do want their wealth to be redistributed and they want to give up power to the people? Obviously not. And then boom, in that sense, the left is controlled opposition because nothing that woman said was accurate. Because in this country, you have a large movement, a large group of people who are appealing to Marxoid rhetoric. You literally have openly Marxist streamers like Hassan and Vaush getting these terminally online leftoids to get excited over Kamala and Waltz, turning them all into Democrat fanboys. But you have this large movement saying they're going to limit the power of the wealthy and have all these social programs and make society more equal, when in fact, they are more funded by the people who have this wealth than the right is. Right? They claim to be in opposition to these power structures, but then everything they do actually advances their interests. So what's going on here? Well, to understand this state of affairs, we need to have a little bit of historical background. So over the course of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, there was what's called the Revolution of Mass and Scale. This era marked a definitive departure from traditional bourgeois capitalism. In the old days, you would have like the president pretty much picking every single government employee personally. Institutions were so compact and small, there wasn't even really such a thing as like the deep state. You didn't have mandarins like you do today, unelected bureaucrats with no oversight, making tons of decisions and exercising power. So this population boom required a fundamental change in all the major institutions in the West. We got the mass state for the government, the mass corporation in the new mass economy, and then the institutions of mass culture like the mass media. The growth required a fundamental restructuring of how these institutions were run, causing a separation of ownership and control. Basically, organs of government and private firms and companies became so large that they were forced to delegate power to these large administrative agencies. The population ballooned, and then the state and corporations responded with bureaucratization. In the old days, there was a pretty direct oversight of a capitalist over his own company, for example. These bourgeois companies were stratified, hierarchical, and there were managers, but by and large, there weren't corporate bureaucrats. You know, management was kind of limited to like a foreman or something on your factory floor. Now, however, to operate these gigantic companies, there are these large teams of people that are necessary, which wield significant amounts of decision-making power and have a distinct relationship to the means of production than the traditional capitalists did, in that they have specific, specialized skills, knowledge, and control over the means of production, but then also don't own them outright. A good example from popular media in the difference between the general ethos or vibe of the old bourgeois elite and the managerial elite would be the guy from There Will Be Blood. He's like a classic bourgeois capitalist. And then the protagonist from Fight Club is a great example of someone in the managerial class. The protagonist from Fight Club is hilariously unnamed because, like, as a managerial elite, he's so alienated and estranged from his own humanity due to his class position, because the managerial elite are complicit in even their own alienation by turning every single person into just another consumer. But anyways, the rugged individualism of the bourgeois order is anathema to the managerial mass corporation, which needs to subordinate the ambitions, values, and eccentricities of its individual managers and workers to its own collective goals and routines. This is a big reason why corporate culture is so fake and stifling. A different skill set is required to enter into this new managerial class, and it has a different set of material interests and different values than traditional bourgeois capitalists. The skill set usually entails a degree, qualifications from a post-secondary school, usually sometimes 2 degrees, and that's usually when they start throwing the E word around, expert. If you have a master's, the media will refer to you as an expert, and your expert opinion will matter when you're telling people monkeypox doesn't spread via sexual contact, so just don't think about it anymore. Or, whatever stupid opinion you have, feel free to write them down in the comments. A large part of the reason these managerial elites are described as technocrats, or their outlook is called technocratic, is because as part of the legitimization of their rule, they have to insist upon the value and efficacy of their own skills. The applied science of management, according to them, can improve the human condition. They have to convince themselves and you that their intervention and social engineering is necessary. The point is, you now need highly specialized knowledge in a particular field of study and approval from the university system to enter this new dominant class. It basically involves just being good at school rather than personal skills or entrepreneurial spirit as with the old bourgeois class. Alright, so that makes sense. It makes sense what their jobs are and how they got here, but why do they have the ideology that they do? Why are they globalists? Well, these companies maximize profits in large part by outsourcing and offshoring jobs. Why would you pay an American worker $25 to $30 an hour and possibly have to deal with OSHA, have some kind of healthcare plan, not fire him when he wants to take time off for something stupid, like going to his kid's birthday? How selfish of him. Or, deal with someone who has the audacity to expect decent working conditions. No! I'd rather have it all done by a Malaysian child. Or really, it used to be and still kind of is Chinese as well. Back in the day, economists, that is, monetary experts, advocated for globalization, saying it was fine that these jobs went overseas because that meant we would get cheaper goods. The idea was loss of these jobs and transition from an industrial economy to a post-industrial service economy would be offset by how cheap the goods would be. Yay, yay, cheap goods, more consumption, yay. So not only did they totally underestimate how many jobs would be lost due to globalization, they also completely fumbled the fact that the price of goods would rise anyways a couple years later. Additionally, it's always good for the economy to have a steady flow of immigrants, according to them. Don't vet them, no background checks, they won't complain. They'll drive down wages domestically or alternatively become dependents on the system who will vote blue no matter who because their livelihoods are on the line if they don't. Let them vote in our elections. We don't need IDs. Who cares? So basically, to cover for the fact they're just stealing wealth from your average American and making the average person's life a heck of a lot worse, the managerial elite comes up with these luxury political issues to keep everyone distracted. Wokeness, as it's popularly called, is a false consciousness or cloak for elite interests. So what Alan here is noticing is what we would call the ideological hegemony of the managerial elite. The real official beginning of managerial ideology would be New Deal liberalism, with the managerial elite absorbing increasingly progressive ideologies later on, like from the New Left, because they best suited their interests. There were precursor ideologies like Woodrow Wilson's progressivism or other expressions of managerialism like Rockefeller republicanism, but our current prevailing ideology best suits their interests, so that's probably what they're going to stick with for the foreseeable future, and it will eventually just intensify into something worse. So in short, the companies that managerials work for often operate transnationally or globally, so they favor policies and engage in practices like regulatory capture, which increase profits and also expand their size. They're not beholden to a government and not really attached to any particular nation state anymore. So they make these sweeping decisions without regard for the host countries they were founded in. and to cover up the fact that they're doing things at your expense, they create distractions. These distractions include, but are not limited to, global warming, issues of sexual identity, feminism with things like the fake wage gap, abortion, reparations for various ethnic minorities. Even though the most honorable Elijah Muhammad proved black people don't need white people to be successful in this country, and it's been 60 years, abortion is also such an easy problem to solve. Just close your legs. Condoms are not breaking left and right. The vast majority of pregnancies that get aborted are from two unrelated people having irresponsible, unprotected, consensual sex. And this is considered a major political issue that women vote Democrat in hordes over. And with sexual identity, it's the fakest of all. This is literally a stand-in for national or cultural identity. You have people who are seriously agitating for the right to chop their own balls off or to sterilize their kids. But to tie this back into the controlled opposition thing, you have these movements promoted because they convince people they're fighting for the expansion of their own freedoms. All the while, wealth is being expropriated from the working class, social mobility is declining, actual political autonomy and civil liberties are being stripped away, and the surveillance state is growing. Another way that their material interests are justified is through the rationalization of the mass economy. Hedonistic egalitarianism best facilitates mass consumption. The tendency to homogenize the audience of mass media is evident in mass advertising. Mass consumption presupposes a uniformity of wants on the part of all consumers, and the advertising must instill in the consumer a demand for uniform products. A uniformity of demand presupposes a uniformity of the character of consumers. Localized bourgeoisie enterprises produced products that were tailored to the needs of consumers in their local markets. They were not as good or fit for mass consumption. So the mass economy is rationalized through this ethic of hedonism, which legitimizes the gratification of appetites of goods and services produced by the mass economy. This is how they turn people into mindless consumers who just endlessly get excited for next product. They have no discernible cultural identity outside of the products they buy. And this is part of why their ideology is necessarily cosmopolitan, universalist, and egalitarian. They have to get these people to believe they are world citizens of the global village. To maintain the cosmopolitan ethos, these people need to shed their parochial identities and adopt this new post-ethnic cosmopolitan identity. And this already kind of dovetails well with white people's self-assessment. You need to look at liberals like this Daenerys Targaryen photo right here. There's an undercurrent of condescension which white people, really especially white liberals, view the rest of the world. Colonialism itself was actually justified on these grounds. You read the writings of a racialist and a eugenicist like Lothrop Stoddard, who was active in the progressive movement in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and he would have told you that colonial domination was actually necessary because it facilitated mutually beneficial cultural exchange, and the West was civilizing the Orient, who were backward, entrenched in superstition and tradition, etc., etc. His New World of Islam book is also required reading for all chuds active in the Discord. But it's very revealing of the mindset these people have. The guy still essentially believed in globalism and global governance, but he was simply overt about the fact that he wanted white people to control these systems, and he was also a cosmopolitan, although it was just a cosmopolitanism that excluded people who weren't Europeans. He was just an early version of the managerial elite. He was an old-school technocrat. Anyway, this worldview was highly paternalistic, and this ethos has actually carried on in a subterranean way in today's liberals. The white man's burden of the bourgeois colonial era basically degraded into today's white savior complex. Deep down, white people, even liberals, believe they've made it. They believe they've created the greatest civilization in human history, even if some of them self-flagellate and repeat narratives like, "It was all stolen." This is just virtue signaling to win over black and brown people and get them further integrated into their system. White people believe this civilization they've built is so great, they've attained this state of post-ethnic, post-national maturity, being world citizens in the global village. And rural white people who aren't on board with this program are just backwards racists. These white liberal managerials also believe, erroneously, that they've created this universalist system with a basis in rational, objective principles that apply to everyone equally regardless of background, and treat minorities like children who aren't really fully responsible for their own actions. This worldview also justifies further expansion of the state. A bureaucracy is concerned with preserving itself and spreading. Like the wage gap or disparities in wealth between different minority groups and whites, the managerials can assert that this is evidence of systemic racism, which demands more technocratic oversight and management to fix. A good example of this would be Ibram X. Kendi's proposal to build an anti-racism wing of the American government. So it's not that the lack of equality of outcome is the result of an active choice of the black community not to solve its own problems. It's the result of systemic racism, which only the white man system can fix, ironically. You can see the rumblings of this sort of demand for oversight and how total it will be in things like proposed vaccine passports. But the end goal of this system is total managerial interference and oversight in everyday life. This is why the more hardcore supporters of the managerial regime are like these vegan urbanists, because they're planning a future mode of living where people can be optimally managed and controlled, which involves being clustered in large metropolitan areas. Anyway, the end goal is total managerial interference and oversight in daily life, and a big part of what the right doesn't really get about politics is that there's no going back. Old America was very much a product of the bourgeois order, and Republican classical liberal political science is reflective of that. As an example, you can't just go start your own media company to compete with CNN. A lot of these institutions like Harvard, the New York Times, and Google are de facto organs of the state which promote managerial interests and influence even if they're ostensibly private institutions. Old America possessed an obsolete social structure which can no longer be maintained, and in a sense the managerial state is a necessary development, but the issue is the way that the managerial elite have decided to act on their interests is highly destructive. Like I was talking about in my capitalism versus communism video, all we have now are competing forms of corporatism on the world stage. That's it. That's how humanity is going to be organized for the foreseeable future on this scale. There's no turning back the clock, and an era of unbridled economic liberalism is completely over. Anyway, to get more into the ideology of the left and its relationship with the managerial elite, Jordan Peterson has described the ideology of the left as postmodern neo-Marxism, much to the chagrin of leftists themselves, and I'd say this is actually an adequate description, although with a couple notable caveats. When you look at the talking points popular on the left, there are clearly ideas taken from postmodern thinkers as well as from Marxist thinkers. Just because classical Marxism and postmodernism contradict each other on some points, like epistemologically, doesn't mean Marxism and postmodernism aren't the two main influences on leftist thought today. And even though leftists will point out that these two ideologies haven't, and really can't be, synthesized into a coherent whole, they can't sidestep the obvious cultural hegemony of the managerial elite, which frequently appeals to this hodgepodge of Marxist social categories and postmodern Foucaultian analysis of power in order to further its own interests. Academia is sort of like the brain of the managerial regime, and neo-Marxism and postmodernism are its two most popular currents of thought. And I've since given up on playing this game of puzzling and trying to determine what the origin of wokeness or whatever you want to call it really is. There are trends, there are currents of thought, but it doesn't really have a single point of origin and is better understood as being adopted based on need. These ideologies just happen to be the best ingredients for false consciousness. The neo-Marxist rhetoric gives the managerial elite a basis for critiquing the remaining elements of the bourgeois order and a justification for further managerial intervention, as does continuing to talk about exploitation and alienation under capitalism. You'll notice with a lot of these media-literate leftist video essayists on YouTube that they engage in ideology critique and sort of shadowbox the defunct cultural hegemony of the bourgeois order, sort of asserting that cis-het capitalist patriarchy is still even a thing. Right, like Dems and leftists need the specter of fascism to motivate them to vote and expend their political energy, to distract them from the fact that democratic policies essentially don't work. Right, like the last 4 years were just objectively economically terrible, but they go, oh, if you don't vote Harris, Trump's going to take away all your rights. It's Handmaid's Tale all over again. Now, with the postmodernism aspect, especially this idea that identities and meanings aren't fixed and essential, but are instead constructed and assigned by power relations, this serves the technocratic utopian impulse in the managerial elite in the sense that it means there's no ceiling to what their expertise can do. In other words, if things don't have essences, then with enough social engineering, they can achieve their utopia. Personally, I think the wedding of these two frameworks is the most obvious in the inconsistencies in arguments they make regarding trans identities, so-called, where they flip back and forth between making empiricist arguments and then postmodernist arguments. Transgenders have female brains, according to them, some of the time, but then also women do not have essential characteristics. So, to make a long story short and to answer Alan's question, the left today is really this activist movement which purports itself to be struggling on behalf of oppressed minorities against capitalist patriarchy while enjoying massive institutional backing, being bankrolled by billionaires, total control of academia, being defended by the mainstream media, etc., etc. Unlike Jordan Peterson, though, I don't think their tolerance of massive contradictions in their worldview is really because they hate the truth in some generic sense. I would say they do hate the truth, but framing it that way turns them into a mustache-twirling villain and diverts the focus to moral questions when much, perhaps really most, of this problem is actually just material. So to put it simply, the left is controlled opposition because they are just these dummy activists who have been tricked into supporting total governmental and corporate domination of daily life. I hope this video was enlightening to some of you. I hope it was educational. I hope it was informative. I hope it wasn't too dense or meandering. I hope you got something out of it. I hope the issues seem a little bit more clear to you. I'd be happy to do a follow-up video to answer any questions you may have. If you leave them down in the comments for me, I'll read them and do a follow-up video. And I could do another video if you're interested on the trajectory of managerial states, where the West is headed, what new form of government is right around the corner. And that's it for this video. Please share it if you enjoyed it. I really need you to share it. Please help me grow this channel. I feel like it's being throttled right now by YouTube for some reason. I don't know what I did. I know what I did, but I don't know what I specifically did. So please share it. Share it on other platforms. Get other people to see it. If you know anyone who would want to watch this video or like my channel, recommend it to them. Recommend it to someone you hate, because they might leave a hate comment, and that's engagement, and that helps me out anyways. So that's it for this video, and Red Channels will catch you in the next one.
Folks, the bourgeois, they know that more and more people are saying it. All these workers, we have the biggest workers, very handsome workers, come up to me and say, Comrade Trump, there is a spectre hunting Europe, and you know what? They're right. These bourgeois are very nasty people, very, very rude and very unfair to the workers. They are stealing our surplus value, and no one is doing anything about it. The proletariat comes up to me every day and says, Comrade Trump, will you lead the revolution? And I got to turn to them and say, look, the instruments of capitalism, what we used to bring about it's destruction, believe me. Obama never wanted to seize them. Well, guess what? I'm seizing them. Landlords, they're done for, folks. Everyone told me, they said, Comrade Trump, you will be the vanguard of the revolution, and they would laugh. The media laughed, the Democrats laughed. Guess who's laughing now?